is Christmas Eve, December 24th, 2020. This is not how we normally do Christmas Eve. And I think you're all aware. It does not change the sentiment. We have gone through 9 months of some anticipation, anxiety, frustration, similar to the awaiting of a new child. With some of the things in the news, we see a little light at the tunnel, but it's also, for many of us, or some of us, it's going to be a while before we see the end of that tunnel. And so we have some more working and waiting to do. Sometimes it feels like a slog, and sometimes it maybe you don't know where the time goes by, where the time goes. And I want to wish you a Merry Christmas, all of you. Talked to Mike Vance yesterday about their family tradition of taking a picture as a family in front of the tree decorated in the fellowship hall, and how for the first time, and that's not going to happen this year. I'm going to share a poem that a pastor, Matt Schultz from Alaska, wrote about adapting Was the Night Before Christmas, to sort of get into those feelings. I also want to share a couple songs. Traditionally, we'll finish with Silent Night. We're going to listen to God Rest You Merry Gentlemen, and I'm going to share a story from the Vinyl Cafe. It is maybe my favorite story, and I will make it through. Part of these is it's not a sadness necessarily, but it is a deep sense of a desire to connect, a missing that opportunity, that reality, in some ways a celebration that at this point we're here. We are not together necessarily, but we are here. So we'll start out with a very upbeat God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen.
God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay. Remember Christ our Savior was born on Christmas Day, to save us all from Satan's power when we were gone astray. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, comfort and joy. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy. Dun, dun, dun. God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay. Remember Christ our Savior was born on Christmas Day, to save us all from Satan's power when we were gone astray. gentlemen, let nothing you dismay. Remember Christ our Savior was born on Christmas Day to save us all from Satan's power when we were gone astray. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, comfort and joy. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy.
Smart wool. Do what feels natural.
This is the picture of what I imagine Christmas Eve service, idyllic Christmas Eve service, gathering and walking and coming and sharing. Our stained glass window has the shape, if not the color, of the one in the picture. The last few years I've been reading a story out of Christmas at the Vinyl Cafe, and this story is not in that book, but it is a story written by Stuart McLean. Its title is Gloves. As a copyright notice, I do not own the rights to this story. And I'm going to read to you. It's the story of Dave and Morley and their family, Sam and Stephanie. It was Dave's idea to take Sam with him to Cape Breton. Just a long weekend, just to visit his mom and her new husband Smith, to give Morley a break. They left on a Thursday night. They had a 2-hour layover in Halifax for supper, and for supper they bought sandwiches in the airport and they watched the group of carolers as they ate. And Dave said, "It's a nice place to be," and Sam frowned. Dave waved his hand in the air at the airport, and he said, "At Christmas time, it's a nice place to be." He was watching a little girl running away from her father squealing, and Sam said, "You should get Mom an iPhone for Christmas. Mom's phone sucks." Sam had a notebook open on the table in front of him, and the word Mom was written at the top of the page. And underneath there was a long list of items. Each item was crossed off. It was coming on Christmas, and for the first time in his life, Sam was as obsessed with the gifts he was going to give as he was with the ones he was going to get. Oh, he had written up a list for himself, written it and revised it and presented it. But this year, what Sam was really taken up with was the impulse to splurge on his family. No macaroni-decorated pencil holders for Sam this year. Sam wanted to buy stuff, good stuff. And he'd already bought a scarf and a Coldplay CD for his sister, a book and a turkey baster for his father. He was having trouble with his mom, however. He wanted to get her a new laptop or a food dehydrator or a deep fryer or an ice cream maker or a massage chair, but everything was too expensive. Sam put his sandwich down and picked up his pen. He wrote "new toaster" at the bottom of the list, and then he frowned and shook his head and he scratched that out. Smith said he would pick them up at the airport, and Dave said, "Don't be crazy, Smith, we'll rent a car." And so off they headed into the cold Cape Breton night along the I-25 and then onto the 223, through Barishwa and Beaver Cove, through the Big Beach and Christmas Island. Big inflatable Santas swaying in the wind led with icicles hanging from the eaves. "Everyone has lights up here," Sam said. It was a perfect weekend. On Saturday morning, Dave took Sam and his cousin Margot over to Macaulay's woodlot to get a Christmas tree. They hiked up the long, sloping trail through the maple bush. Their breath, past the wind, was just like the one it was when Dave was a kid and he walked up there with his father. That night after supper, the guitars came out. Dave and his sister, and she had her fiddle, and everyone playing and singing along, everyone except Sam. Sam was sitting in the corner, writing in his notebook. They left on Sunday afternoon, the sky gray and heavy with snow. They were about 40 minutes coming through the highlands, twisting and turning through the forest and the farms. After a half hour, Sam said, "I can't seem to find a suitable present for Mom." Dave said she really liked the pencil holder you made her last year. Maybe you could make her something. And Sam said, I want to buy her something. Ah, said Dave as they drove out of the hills. It's hard to shop for Mom. She loves everything you give her, exactly. Whatever it is, it's the perfect thing. Exactly, said Sam's head. That's hard, said Dave. And expensive, said Sam. There may be no better place in the world for a father and son to have a heart-to-heart conversation than in a car moving through the night. First off, they don't have to look at one another. Second, and most importantly, they both know that if things get awkward, the ride will eventually come to an end, and with it, the awkwardness too. Dave reached down and turned down the radio. Did I ever tell you about the Christmas I met your mom? He said. And Sam kept staring at the road. Sam said, in the States, right? Dave said, that's right. I was working in the States, traveling with a show. You met her at a skating rink in Memphis. It's closed that day. Providence, Rhode Island, Dave said. Dave smiled in the darkness of the car and the glow of the dashboard. They both sat quietly for a moment, Dave lost in the glow of the memory. And then Sam said, you ran into her on the skating rink and you had to take her to the hospital for stitches. Well, said Dave, yeah, that's right. I think I made a big impression. What happened? Said Sam. Well, said Dave, I'm trying to tell you. Dave and Morley corresponded for 6 years, letters and some phone calls back and forth, but they had not managed another collision since that fateful night at the skating rink in Providence, Rhode Island. The year I'm telling you about, the Christmas Dave is telling Sam about, they had arranged to get together on Boxing Day. They hadn't told anyone in the family about, and Morley didn't want to jinx it. But he thought about her obsessively. And now, about to see her after 6 long years, what he thought about mostly was that he had to win her love. And one of the ways he thought he could do that was by getting her the perfect Christmas present. Dave didn't have the foggiest idea what that present could be. What he thought was that he would find something for her when he got home from Big Narrows for Christmas. It was only when he got home that he realized the foolishness of that thought. He wandered up and down River Street on the day before Christmas, growing in desperation. There was a limited number of choices in town. Frenchie's used clothing, Angus Mac, the nails, Angus MacDonald's post office and general store, Rutledge's hardware, and Arnie Gallagher's florist travel agency and tackle shop. By mid-afternoon, Dave was buying things out of sheer desperation. Fruitcake from Kerrigan's, a crocheted toilet paper cover from the church bazaar, and a fishing lure and a box of frozen minnows from Arnie's. He stumbled home on Christmas Eve in a state of despair. There'd be no shopping on Christmas Day, and as he was leaving in the morning after Morley was meeting him in the airport, he couldn't show up empty-handed. Why not? Said Sam. What? Said Dave. Why couldn't you show up empty-handed? Well, because he had already told Morley he had gotten her a present, hadn't he? And she had gone and got one for him, and they had talked about it on the phone. She seemed quite excited about the idea. Dave decided his only hope was that his sister or his mother would get something on Christmas morning that he could borrow. His mother got oven mitts and a crocheted toilet paper cover, and her sister got a box of frozen minnows. It was only when everyone was getting ready for bed that the solution dawned on Dave. He would leave early, he would stop in Sydney on the way to the airport, and he would get something at the Sydney Boxing Day sale. That was a good idea, Sam said. And Dave said genius should never be confused with desperation. They were still in the car. They were pulling into Sydney themselves. Dave turned on to George Street and drove downtown. When he got there, he pulled over in front of a little store on Charlotte Street. Sam said, "Why are we stopping?" Dave said, "I'm going to tell you." When Dave had pulled into Sydney on that desperate Boxing Day that I'm telling you about, there were exactly 3 cars parked on the street where he had stopped. One was his, the other 2 had 6 inches of snow covering them from bumper to bumper. There wasn't a soul to be seen, and not a fat chance any Boxing Day bonanza. Dave had expected hustle and bustle. He'd been away too long. Sydney was shut up tight. He had 3 hours before his plane left, so he took a long, slow drive around town. He was looking for any store that might be open, dreading what he might find. The world's largest Toblerone just wasn't going to cut it. And then, when he had given up all hope, while he was waiting at a red light on the edge of town when he was heading to the airport, he glanced into his rearview mirror and saw a woman step up onto the sidewalk and move out of the falling snow under a large storefront awning and disappear through a door into a store, an open store. How could he have missed it? Dave did a U-turn. He wheeled over to the curb and he parked. I say park. He only parked in a manner of speaking. He fishtailed over to the curb and he jumped out as the car was coming to a stop. As I said, it had started to snow. Dave stood there for a moment looking around, and then he followed the line of footsteps across the street onto the sidewalk and up to the door. The lights were spilling out of the store window onto the snowy sidewalk, and there were people inside. Dave pressed his face to the window, and there was a man and a woman in there, and he grabbed the door handle and pulled, but it was locked. Now, the ability to knock at a locked store door after hours and convince who's ever in there to throw the door open is an underappreciated art. Dave pulled out all the stops, knocking and smiling, nodding and benign encouragement, but in the end it was honesty that won the day. "I'm in a jam," said Dave, smiling and nodding. The woman cracked the door, but only just enough so she could talk to him. "I'm picking up my girlfriend to take her to her parents for Christmas, and I haven't." He hesitated for a moment, then he let it all out. "No rush. I haven't bought her a present." The man who was standing behind the woman walked over to the door and said, "We're only here to tidy the shelves. We're getting ready for tomorrow. We aren't supposed to sell things. It's against the law. We could actually get in trouble." The lady turned and looked at the man and then at Dave, and Dave said, "I know I shouldn't have left it this long. I just thought I could get something at the Boxing Day sales. Today," he put it out there, and when he did, goodness demonstrated one more time that it is just often just looking for an opportunity to reveal itself. "How can we help you?" said the woman, stepping back from the door so he could come in. The display beside him was piled high with heavy woolen sweaters, coats hung on the wall. It was right. There was a jewelry case by the cash register. Dave headed right for the jewelry case. He cast his eyes over silver rings and strands of pearls and brooches of various shapes, and then he saw glittering and sparkling on the stretch of black velvet the most beautiful bracelet he had ever seen, a delicate band, a gold link studded with tiny diamonds. That one's," said Dave. "It's perfect." The lady glanced at Dave's soggy running shoes, his frayed bell-bottom jeans, the tennis bracelet, she said. Now Dave had never bought jewelry before in his life, and he didn't know anything about jewelry. He looked at the lady. "It's perfect, right?" he said. He already had his wallet out, and he was counting his money, but she didn't take it. Instead, she picked up the bracelet and held it in the light. It was a pretty bracelet. "But does Morley wear a lot of jewelry?" "Well," said Dave, "not that I remember." "Does she play tennis?" And Dave sighed. If Dave walked into that store today and walked right over to that jewelry case by the cash register and picked that bracelet up, the woman whose name is Alice would have been delighted to tell it to him as she had been delighted to sell bracelets and brooches to countless men over the years. But the Dave who was standing in front of her on that Boxing Day evening all those years ago was not the man who would stand in front of her today. That was 27-year-old Dave clutching that bracelet. And Alice, he looked very, very young. He looked every month his age, young and lost, confused, bewildered, and not a little desperate. Leonard said to Alice, to her husband, "Don't just stand there, staring at this poor young man. Get him a mug of tea." Alice plunked the mug of tea onto a table which she would later pile with scarves. And so she said, "Tell me about the girl." And Alice and Leonard drank their tea while Dave told them all about Morley and his hopes and his dreams for the things that you can tell. Perfect strangers, that you can tell perfect strangers that you can't tell your family. Almost an hour passed as the snow fell gently outside. Alice got up and started walking toward the cash register, and then she turned and came back. "You know," she said, as she looked over at her husband, who had a box open on the floor and was filling a display with women's socks. "You know," she said, "one year Leonard gave me a pair of pinking shears for Christmas. Best present ever." And when Dave left the store a half hour later, he was carrying a little bag. In it was a pair of soft suede gloves in the bag. The last thing the woman said to him was, "I think she'll love the gloves. I think they're perfect." And Dave was smiling. "Me too," he said. It was dark outside. The snow had already covered over the footprints he had made on his way in. "I can still remember exactly what it looked like," said Dave, sitting there in my rented car, looking along the street. He pointed at the awning on the store that he and Sam were parked in front of. "Come on," he said. And he and Sam got out of the car and walked up to the window. The store was closed. Dave said, "Remember, I came down here a few years ago to help Grandma in the fall. On the way home, I dropped in and Alice was still there, but her husband had died. She remembered me, though. She made me tea. I told her about you and your sister." 2 days later, back at home, just a few days before Christmas, Dave went into Sam's room. Sam was in bed. He was reading, and Dave was holding a large shopping bag. Excuse me. "This is for you," he said, "to give to your mother. There's wrapping paper downstairs. You should wrap it yourself and make a card." Sam said, "It's okay. I got her something myself." Christmas morning at Dave's house was following its morning normal routine. They got up early and Sam and Stephanie came into Dave and Morley's bedroom and they opened their stockings. And after that, they had breakfast, and after breakfast, everyone still in their pajamas went into the living room and opened presents. Somewhere in the middle of the mass in the morning, Sam presented his mother with her gift. "This is for you." A small rectangle wrapped in red paper with green ribbon that looked like it had been tied by a tiny rodent. It was a photograph in a black frame, a picture of Dave taken from behind. He was peering into a store window. "It's lovely," said Morley. And she passed it to Dave, and Dave stared at the photo. And then at the ceiling. "How did you get that?" he said. And Sam smiled shyly. "With your phone," he said. "I took it with your phone when you weren't looking." Dave said, "I didn't know I had a camera in my phone." Sam said to Morley, "You like it?" Morley passed the picture to Stephanie, and it was Stephanie who said, "I don't get it." Morley looked at her son and then at her husband, who seemed to be tearing up, and Morley said, "I don't think I get it either." And they all sat there while Dave told the story all over again. "Everything I've told you so far, plus one more small bit. When I told Alice about Mom," Dave said, "I told her that night Mom and I met in the rink, she didn't have gloves on." He looked at Morley. "Do you remember that in the car on the way to the hospital I asked you if your hands were cold?" And then he turned to Sam and Stephanie and she said yes, and they were cold, but then she rarely wore gloves. She said they felt bad. She felt bad buying new ones because she lost them all the time. And I thought, just because she loses gloves doesn't mean she doesn't deserve new ones now and then. Morley had never heard the story of how Dave had bought those gloves before. When Dave was finished, she looked down at her tea and smiled, and then without a word, she disappeared upstairs. She reappeared a few minutes later. She was holding a lump of stiff brown suede in her hands. The gloves are old now. the fingertips almost completely worn through. And there are small tears in the tears in the palm. Morley held them up proudly. The only pair of gloves I never lost. As she said this, as she put the gloves on the mantelpiece beside the picture of Dave peering in the shop window. And that is the story of Dave and Morley's first Christmas. There have been many since. Dave hasn't always been that successful with his gifts, but there have been lots of memorable Christmases. The year he decorated the pear tree in the backyard. The year he assembled the snowmaking machine. The Christmas party at the Andersons when he spiked the kids' punch. The year his tongue froze to the TV antenna. The year he cooked the turkey. And that very first year. The gloves when Dave managed to tell Morley how he really felt about her, and to tell her everything she needed to know about him. Sam has given his mother many wonderful things over the years. This was his first grown-up present. It'll be hard to top, because he didn't only give her the picture of the the frame he bought to put it in. He also gave her the story that went with it. It's a story of coming together, looking back for sure, but most importantly, a looking forward to all the stories that are yet to come. This is a poem, an adaptation of The Night Before Christmas by Matt Schultz, I mentioned earlier. 'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the town not a person was stirring. We were all hunkered down. The masks were all hung from their ear straps with care, in hopes that a vaccine soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their rooms, while Mom and I logged out of meetings on Zoom. We changed out of our work sweatpants into our jammies, sad to be so far from grandpas and Grammys. Christmas was different this year, that's for certain. People felt lonely with hearts that were hurting. Our Christmas time cheerfulness stuck in a lurch, with no room at the inn and no one in the church. Travel bans thrown up between towns and nations, part cabin fever and part isolation. Homeschool was hectic and holidays harried. My mood was more mopey and maudlin than merry. When here in my heart there rose such a clatter, I gladly remembered the heart of the matter. Christmas is more than the usual traditions, compulsively redone in rote repetition. We miss those things, sure, but they will return. This temporary turmoil's only short term. And added to that, this trouble helps others. Our quarantines help save our sisters and brothers. And caring for others, well, that's the whole deal. That's living the deep Christmas spirit for real. Our hope and our peace, our joy and our love, they're as bright as the Bethlehem star up above. And what happened next in Alaska, I'd say the spirit of Christmas showed up anyway. It showed up in cards and gifts mailed state to state, even as some get there just slightly late. It came without gatherings, it came without crowds, it came without carol groups singing out loud. It came without parties to brighten our lives, it came without potlucks, without PS5s. But Christmas showed up in the calls across miles, in Zooms and in texts instead of hugs and smiles. It showed up in generous charitable donations in churches who now have online congregations. It showed up in the love of the simple, kind task of caring for others by wearing a mask. In treats left at doorsteps by night and by day, and shouts of Merry Christmas from 6 feet away. And someday, my friends, someday we'll be back to all of those potlucks and parties we lack, to singing in choirs and singing in bars, to cozy carpooling squished into one car, to shaking hands, high fives, fist bumps and hugs, to airlines with cinder rows packed in real snug, to going to games where we cheer in the bleachers, to going to school with our favorite teachers, to clicking a headline that has happy news, to passing the peace side by side in these pews, to restaurants and barbershops, concerts aplenty, when finally we're through with 2020. This hard time will pass. Keep the faith. Do not fear. We'll gather again, my friends, same time next year. So keep love and peace, hope and joy as your light. Merry Christmas. As is tradition, we will close with Silent Night.